You're listening to Permission To, the podcast where we dive into the science and soul of owning your worthiness as a perfectly imperfect human being. I'm your host, Sam Dew, psychotherapist, positive psychology coach, mama to a beautiful 5-year-old Amelie, and passionate advocate for living an inspired life. My aim is to show you that you have full permission to own your worthiness so that you can embrace your true nature and begin walking boldly toward your dreams. Let's dive in. Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Permission To. I have recently rearranged my office and I now have my desk facing out the window, so I've got a beautiful view of the trees and the birds and the sun is shining, and it just feels like a really delicious day to be here with you. And I've got a really different episode planned today. This episode is about 2 books that changed my life and the stories behind these books. So not so much teaching and lessons and strategies, but more the stories, about these 2 books and how they touched me, how they changed me. So I think that it's really, really interesting how often for me I've been reading a lot of books and I've just been drawn to books that really confirm how I already see the world. For example, I recently read this book called Radically Content, and it was so beautiful. I know a lot of you, when I shared it on Instagram, were really drawn to it. It was such a beautiful book, but it was very much confirming of what I already believed about the world, what I already know about the world around, permission to not need to hustle and not need to keep, working so hard, and permission to be content, and that piece around, you're already enough, you're already worthy. And so it's so nice to read those books that kind of confirm or give us like a different lens to a similar worldview that we already have. And maybe one day I will do an episode on, books that feel really aligned with me. But today I want to talk about 2 books that really shook me to the core, that really changed the way I saw the world. And I think it's so interesting how sometimes we read a book at a certain time in our life where we're struggling with something or we're searching for something, and that book we just find it at the right time. And we're really open to changing the way we look at things when we read those books. And so that's what these books are about. This does have a bit of a trigger warning because, the experiences in the books and also maybe the life experiences that led me to decide to read these books, we will be touching on content around grief and loss and death and dying. And so I think that if you don't feel like, today's the right time to listen to an episode like that, or it doesn't feel right for you right now, full permission to skip this episode and I'll be with you next week. But yeah, if you feel like this is something that interests you, let's dive in. So the first book that I am going to share is called Staring at the Sun by Irvin Yalom. And this book is about essentially overcoming the dread of death or the fear of death. And there's a few different ways that the title has been worded, but the one that I read was Overcoming the Dread of Death. And so with this episode, with this book, a bit of context. So I was working at a hospital in the cancer centre when I was a social worker in my mid-20s, and I was there for about 3 years, mostly supporting people who had a family member with leukemia, brain tumours, all different types of cancer. And the thing about that job was, a lot of people that I supported actually survived cancer. But obviously cancer still has a massive, massive impact on the whole family, on your psychological well-being, on, your future health. It's such a, it's not just about, surviving the cancer. It's all the experiences that come with that. But there was also a lot of grief and loss and death and dying. And as a fairly young woman, and, maybe I was about 5 years into my career as a social worker, I found it really hard. I found it really hard when, if I was supporting a patient and they passed away, either expectedly or, quite traumatically and unexpectedly, I found it hard. And it's really interesting working in a hospital. I think I'm a very soft, sensitive person, and I don't know if that environment is great for me. I learnt so much from that experience, and I have so much respect for the families that I supported and the individuals I supported, like so much gratitude for them for everything I learnt. But I didn't have the most supportive workplace. My supervisor was a social worker who was very burnt out, and so I remember coming to her and just saying, I'm really finding it hard when I lose a patient. Like it feel, I'm being really affected by it, and what do you suggest I do? And she basically was like, maybe this job isn't right for you, which possibly was something that I was going to come to learn in a couple of years, but not really the most supportive thing for a supervisor to say at that time. And I think because she was so burnt out, she just didn't have any space to support me, around navigating that role. So anyone who doesn't know, like in social work, we usually get like weekly or fortnightly supervision, which is a space to talk about your clients, a space to unpack your practice and make sure you're doing the best job possible to support your clients. And I really believe that actually that kind of process would be great for coaches to have as well. But what I ended up doing was going and getting external supervision. So paying and using my own time on a Saturday to go and get supervision and support outside of my workplace. And the person that was supervising me and supporting me recommended this book because he knew that I was really struggling with the concept of death and dying. And so this book, Staring at the Sun by Irvin Yalom, came into my life. And for anyone who doesn't know Irving, he is a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist who is just an amazing storyteller and an amazing therapist. And so this book basically turns our attention to one of our greatest fears as humans, or I guess essentially what he would say is our greatest fear, our fear of death. And he suggests that what he calls the awakening experience can help us to acknowledge, accept, and make use of our fear of death in a positive manner. So his theory was that essentially, and he goes through and shares stories of a lot of his counselling clients and how a lot of their presentations he really believed was a fear of death. And so we can have an awakening experience often following a loss, a trauma, or the death of a loved one, illness, or just growing old. And yeah, many of us have had experiences, right, that were really traumatic, or where we've lost something or someone, and that has kind of woken us up. As much as it's been traumatic and painful, it's also woken us up to life. And what he shows us is how that kind of awakening can be the turning point for a meaningful life. So it's such a useful book because it helps you to deal with fear of death and the anxiety around, the fact that nothing in life lasts forever. And he kind of argues that once we confront our mortality, we are going to be inspired to rearrange our priorities, communicate more deeply with those we love, and appreciate more keenly the beauty of life, and also be willing to take risks to live a fulfilling life. And it's interesting because one of my most popular emails is around this idea of risking being alive and this concept that if I died tomorrow, I would know that I had lived a good life, a meaningful life. And I think this book really helped me to consider that, to consider like, what is a meaningful life? What is most important to me? You know, we can't take life for granted. We don't know how long we've got. And so I feel like I've lived my life with more discernment and with more depth since reading this book. It was also very comforting from a point of view around, you know, and everyone's going to have different viewpoints on this, obviously, because he's not religious. And so one of the concepts that I found really comforting in the book was that once someone dies, their awareness has gone too. And so, you know, we all have this fear of like, what am I going to be missing out on after I die, and what will it be like? But he was essentially saying, like, once you're gone, your awareness is gone as well. And so then all the pain and the suffering is gone as well. But I also loved how he talked about the fact that even when someone is no longer alive, they are still a part of the ecosystem, you know, like that you're still breathing in the air of someone who was living, you know, years ago. And also the lifelong, the legacy that people leave behind, in the way that they have touched other people's lives and influenced other people's lives, and memories and stories and all of that. So there were so many concepts that I found really comforting as a social worker, you know, who was supporting people who were sometimes, you know, in palliative care and you know, facing their own fear of death. But it also taught me so much about living and, yeah, how to live and how to live a meaningful life. So, yeah, this is a really... It's not just a book for therapists, but if you're interested in therapy, I highly recommend it, because I just love the way he tells stories, and I love the way he's brave enough to talk about concepts that I feel like there's so much stigma about talking about death. It's like almost like people are scared. If you talk about death, you're more likely to die, which is obviously magical thinking. Like that's not the way life works. But it was really interesting. I remember like living in Melbourne, and I was single and I had all this free time before I was a mama. And so I used to like go and read my books at cafes. And I remember reading this book and like someone coming up to me and going, oh, that's a bit heavy for a Saturday. Or, you know, like there was this kind of this negative judgment, which I guess is interesting. He even talks about that in the book. Like there's so much stigma and negativity around death. But if we think about it as another part of life, you know, like we celebrate and we honor birth. Why is it so negative for someone to be reading a book about death on a Saturday at a cafe, you know? So anyway, if you do read it, be prepared that like some people have opinions and reactions, but I think that is all the more reason to kind of read this. So yeah, that's the first book. And the second book that also I feel like really changed the way I see life was maybe 4 years later, when I was living in London with my boyfriend at the time, Nick, who's now my husband. And he had been unemployed for a really long time. I had moved away from like my family and friends and moved to London, and I just was finding it hard. I think I was, you know, struggling a little bit with low mood. The weather and the temperature and everything just didn't really suit my personality. I was also commuting like a really long way to my training and work. Like I think I was spending almost 2 hours commuting each way when I was training as a cognitive behavioral therapist. So yeah, my mood was flat. I was really flat. I was really in a really negative headspace. I was really struggling. And I found this book, which is also very famous. You may have already read it. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And basically, again, written by a psychiatrist, someone who actually created his own type of existential therapy known as logotherapy. So Viktor Frankl's book is basically a memoir, and it's describing his experience of life in Nazi death camps, and also the lessons that he learned around spiritual survival. And that was based on his own experiences and the stories of his patients. And he argues that we cannot avoid suffering, but we can choose how to cope with it. And he's all about meaning making, like, so finding meaning and moving forward with renewed purpose. So basically, the heart of his theory, logotherapy, is that the primary human drive is not pleasure, but the pursuit of what we find meaningful. And I found this really, really comforting because I wasn't really enjoying life in London, but there was a lot of meaning. There was a lot of meaning to be made. I was on like a journey, I guess. I was, creating a new life for myself with a new partner. I'd taken a lot of risks. Like, there was a lot of meaning in that experience of living in London and struggling through that. And I use this so much with my clients, like looking at, well, what meaning are you making of this situation? It's all about those stories that we tell ourselves, right? And, is there a way that this event or this experience can be meaningful? And I think it's so important. Like, if you have someone in your life who's grieving or has been traumatized, please don't push meaning onto them. Like, don't, there's all these concepts of post-traumatic growth and, that we can grow through traumatic experiences, which is very true. But I think we have to allow the person who's been there, who's been in the trauma or who's been through the grief to get there themselves. If we push someone to find meaning in a horrible situation straight away, that can feel very much to them like gaslighting, like someone's not validating their feelings. So I think this is a very personal journey. When we feel ready to make meaning from a challenging situation, from a hard situation, that allows us to carry forward with hope and purpose. This book, it is very heavy in theory towards the second half of the book. And I know not everyone's going to enjoy that, but I also know a lot of my community are life coaches, therapists, allied health workers. So you may have already read it, but I feel like it really changed my life. It helped me to stop thinking about that life's only about having fun and having pleasure. Like, not all times in my life are going to be fun and going to be great. But there's always I can always find meaning in my life. I can always make it meaningful. So those are my 2 books for this week. I feel like I would love to do this more regularly. So please let me know if you enjoyed this episode, if you really enjoyed just hearing like personal stories and about books that I found really meaningful and life-changing. Please let me know, because I've got like a long list. I just wanted to start with 2 to keep it short. But that is it, and I will be back with you next week. Mwah!